This program is brought to you by Emory University.
On April 8, 2014, the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence at Emory University hosted a talk by Cecilia Cancellaro, an editor and literary agent and co-founder of the media development agency Idea Architects. In this video, Ms. Cancellaro shares time-tested strategies from her many years of publishing experience, discusses the trends and expectations for faculty authors in the current scholarly publishing environment, and explains what scholars must do to be successful in the publishing world.
The reason that I started Idea Architects was because of the realization that even though the academy is a professional world in which publishing is imperative, most academics get very little guidance about the publishing process and the ways in which they can shape and present their work most successfully. And on the other side of that coin, many academic publishers these days have too little time to devote to author care, book development, and so on. Even scholarly presses have a bottom line to think about, and in the present publishing climate, that's never been more true. So I won't spend much time talking about the overall state of scholarly publishing and giving you statistics that, although interesting, will offer little in the way of practical advice. But I will say that between the 1960s and the 1990s, the number of university presses increased significantly, from 60 to 96. And their output increased dramatically as well, from 41 titles per year on average to 88. Things plateaued after that, and although there definitely have been changes in how various segments of the market purchase and consume scholarly material, for the most part, university presses still publish between 8,000 and 9,000 books per year. That sounds pretty good until you hold it up next to the number of PhDs being produced in North America annually, which is somewhere around 50,000. Not all of these, of course, are in humanities and related fields where a book is the requirement for tenure. But even if 1/3 of those 50,000 falls into this category, that means there are many dissertations and manuscripts vying for those available book contracts. So what I want to do today is just to take our focus off the big picture somewhat and talk specifically and practically about getting a scholarly-based book published and published successfully. What I find myself doing on a daily basis for my clients, who range from brand new PhDs to very senior scholars who've published many books, is demystifying the publication process. And it varies greatly from press to press. Even among university presses, the process is not the same. I offer guidance and support through every stage, as Allison said, from shaping an initial book outline to developing and structuring the manuscript to crafting a book proposal, which is hugely important in the process. And I also provide advice to people whose work is going through the publisher's review process, which again varies from press to press. And often going into the process, you have no idea exactly what the process is, except what you've heard from colleagues, and their press may do it differently. So it's anxiety making. So I also help make sense of the marketing plans that are, and the publication plans that are often shown to you when a publisher offers you a contract. Looking at those two documents can tell you a lot about what the publisher expects of your book and how they think your book will perform, and you might not realize that just from looking at it. So it's important to really know that. And as an aside, I just want to say that the services that I offer grew out of my interactions with scholars about their specific book projects and placing those projects with the right press. That is to say that when I created this business, and I have a co-founder who works on the West Coast, and his list is much more commercial than mine. I wanted to work with scholars. I knew that's what I wanted to do, and I wanted to work with serious nonfiction books. So from my 15 years acquiring books, for Routledge, I just sort of used the knowledge that I had of what scholars needed to shape my company. So the services that I provide are based on the need that I saw. So in thinking about the best way to cover as much material as possible in a short time, and I also really wanted to make it usable, I decided that it would be a good idea to contact several university press editors who acquire books in a number of disciplines. Some have been doing it for a very long time. Other people I contacted are quite new. They're from a range of presses, big, small, medium-sized, some highly subsidized presses, others less so, some more traditional in their approach, and others not so much. I asked each of them for their best publishing advice. In other words, if they could only share a few things, what do they think every scholar needs to know and do in order to be successful securing a book contract with the right press? I use that phrase, the right press, and it's an important idea for me. Not all presses are equal for all books, and it's important as a writer to understand and seek out a press that best serves your specific work. For example, you might have a book in the field of women's history, let's say U.S. women's history. There might be a press with a strong and prestigious U.S. history list, but perhaps your book would be one of the few on that list that provides a gendered perspective. If that's the case, that press might do little targeted marketing to women's historians. They may not attend and display books at the Berkshire Women's History Conference, and they may not reach out to more interdisciplinary women's studies audiences who might be quite interested in the work. So in that case, perhaps a press with a strong U.S. history list and a strong women's studies list might be a better option. So for my talk today, I polled editors and I added my own advice and perspective, and the result is a list of guidelines that I think will benefit anyone writing and seeking publication for a scholarly book, whether it's your first book or your fifth book. And one other point that I really would like to make is that I'm not affiliated with a press, so my advice is not publisher-centric. It's not just what authors need to do to get a publisher, but also what publishers should be doing to get you to publish your book with them. While you are telling publishers why they should publish your book, they should also be telling you why their press is a good press for your book. That's super important, and I'll get back to that later when I talk a little about your relationship with your editor. So I received, what was interesting is that I sent this email out to about 15 people, and they all responded within 24 hours with a list of 4 or 5 points. So these are things that are, sort of foremost in their mind. I took them and I tried to break them down into categories, and I came up with 4 categories. The first one is the book itself. The second one is the pitch, meaning how one can most effectively present their work to a press. The third one is the process, and the fourth one is the market. So starting off with the book. In the book category, the first couple of comments that I received relate specifically to first books based on dissertations. A dissertation is not a book. It serves a completely different purpose, and any academic editor will tell you that. And transforming a dissertation into a book can be really tedious work because, unfortunately, people are not encouraged to write their dissertations as books, or even sometimes in anything that resembles what a book needs to look like. So, you will really need to convince an editor, if you're trying to publish a dissertation, that you have a book and not a dissertation. So many of the editors had advice, even though I didn't ask specifically for that, many of them came back with points about this, because it's something they see all the time. So here's just a couple that I picked out that I think are really useful. Read your dissertation as though it were someone else's book, as you think about what you need to do to transform it into a book. And it's best to revise material significantly before sending it out. You might be eager to start showing your work to editors. I know there's pressure for tenure files, etc., but you do yourself a disservice if you send it out too early. You should really polish some chapters into the form that would be their form in an actual book manuscript, and it should not at all, the work you send out should not at all be recognizable as a dissertation chapter. And the reason for this is that if an editor sees those chapters and they read like book chapters, they will know immediately that you can transform your dissertation into a book. If they see dissertation chapters, they will see a great idea, they will see original work, but they might have less confidence in your ability to make it into what it needs to be to succeed. The second point is a dissertation demonstrates scholarly expertise. A first book assumes it. In other words, much of what's included in a dissertation to demonstrate knowledge of a field and a complete grasp of the existing literature does not belong in a book. So, it's also about developing your voice, sounding like you are the authority, and convincing first your editor about that, and then your readers. And now more generally, in the category of the book, here are some other guidelines. Books have conclusions. I thought that was a good one to think about. A test of a good chapter is whether it can be read by itself. If it can, it's not a good book chapter. Meaning, obviously, a chapter should be connected to what comes before it and what what comes after it in an obvious but very seamless way. And here's one that also speaks to the business of publishing. Craft your manuscript so it makes a powerful argument in as few pages as possible. That's always a good thing. But because the pressure on book budgets is so enormous, not only will this advice make your book stronger and more appealing and marketable, it will also help the publisher to price it competitively so that you won't have a $90, a monograph that no one can afford to buy. If the page length is a certain, if there are a certain amount of pages, the book's going to be really super expensive. And also, many editors will say the book has to be much shorter. So they will sort of tell you that, but you should be thinking of that as you're writing. The next one, you have to decide what kind of book you want to write and recognize and accept the costs and benefits that come with each one. A book that will satisfy your academic colleagues may be too nuanced for a non-academic reader. A book that will appeal to a non-academic readership usually has a very straightforward argument that you and your colleagues will feel is oversimplified. Related to that, if you really do want to write for a general non-academic reader, it would be good to engage general non-academic readers about your work and your ideas for the book. Consider it just informal market research. Editors get, I'd say 85% of the proposals they see talk about how the book is not just for scholars or graduate students or to be used in the classroom, but it also will have crossover appeal to general readers. It doesn't have to. University presses don't need that in a book, so it's important to really be honest about what your book is doing and who it's for. The next one is specifically about the writing. Writing can be clear and compelling without compromising a book's scholarly integrity. I'm a firm believer in that. Even the most academic book can be written accessibly, and when it is, the market does grow. So some of the most successful books I published at Routledge were books that had very cutting-edge new scholarly ideas, but were written in such a way that not only were they sort of being scooped up by scholars who were doing research in the field, they started to get used in undergraduate classrooms. So if you write it accessibly, those things really may happen, even if you don't necessarily expect that they will at first. You probably all know William Germano's book, Getting It Published. It's a guide for scholars who are publishing what he calls serious books. He says that making writing clearer and sharper is essential. Everyone will tell you that. He gives a good strategy, I think. It's a nice sort of succinct way to think about how you can go about doing this. He says that one of the best ways to improve academic prose is to focus on openings. Opening sentences, opening sections, opening paragraphs. He suggests that when you're preparing your manuscript for submission to editors and then outside reviewers, set aside extra time to focus on the first page, the first paragraphs, the first sentences. Every one of those openings should really accomplish something. The next one is remember that a book does not exist and succeed because of what you want to say, but because of what you have to say that someone else wants or needs to know. And it's up to you to convince them that what you're saying will be valuable to them. And you need to do that very early on in the book, and even more importantly, very early on in the book proposal. And the next point is related to that, and it's just a quote that an editor sent me, and she said, it's really great for people to think that, in these terms, a book is not a diary, a book is a letter. And the last point in the book category is about establishing a writing schedule and sticking with it as much as possible. I know how hard that is. I know, you're teaching, you're doing a million other things. I know that's super hard. But what I have found is that in my work, something that became clear that I hadn't planned on happening was that when I started working with people, and we just had this back and forth where they'd send me a few pages or they'd send me a chapter and I'd get back to them. The back and forth thing gave them momentum and helped them to write more quickly. So whether it's another colleague or it's a graduate student or you have a writing group or you hire a developmental editor, establish something like that just makes you have to send something out, even if it's not ready to be sent out in your eyes, just to get the process going. That I can't tell you how many times that happens for people I'm working with, and like I said, it was an unexpected sort of side effect of the work that I do. The second category is the pitch. I think scholars hate this more than anything else, and I understand why. And this first one, again, is about if you're writing a first book that's based on a dissertation. If you're writing a book that's based on your dissertation, never, ever call it a dissertation. Don't even mention dissertation when you're pitching it to publishers. It stopped being a dissertation after your defense, and publishers want to publish a book. So, and you have a book, so go out and talk about it like a book, and they will be grateful that you're doing that. And it will show them that you're thinking in those terms. And the next one is that this is also really difficult. You need to articulate the following about your book in 3 sentences: the subject or thesis, the intervention it makes, and the argument, the so what of the book. This is one of the tasks that most of the people I work with find the most difficult of all, but it's so important. What you should remember when you're being asked to do this is that when the person who's the editor, who's going into their editorial meeting to sort of pitch your book to the editorial board, they have to be able to do that. So you want to give them the tools to do that. You want to give them the tools so that they can go in and say what they need to say about your book that really gets to the heart of what makes it original, why it will be a marketable book. And then once your book is under contract and it's about to be published, the editor has to address sales reps and book buyers. And you literally can talk about every book for 2 minutes. So you're the expert on your book. You know why it's important. You will know better than your editor how it fits in and why you wrote it and what need you think it fills. So give them that. Give them those tools. They can figure it out and they'll put it in there, but you know it. So you tell them what it's doing. Sell yourself. Tell editors in the first paragraph of your proposal what your argument is, why it matters, and who it's for. The book proposal is a selling tool, and it should be written to sell your topic to an editor. If an editor likes the project, gets supportive outside reviews, and ultimately proposes the book to her or his editorial committee, they will rely heavily on that book proposal. That book proposal will be distributed with the materials for the editorial meeting. All of the colleagues will read it. I mean, that book proposal will be looked at by many people, by the people who are making decisions about your book. So think about that when you're writing it, and just make sure that when you send that out, you feel really confident that it's polished and that it really accurately represents your book. It doesn't have to be long. I mean, it can be 15 pages. It could be, some are less than that, but it needs to be really focused and clear, and it needs to really give sort of that pitch, the pitch that's so hard to do, but it's super important. The next one is about sample chapters. I sort of addressed this a little bit before. So when you send your book proposal out, you should have a couple, even if the manuscript is not finished, you should have at least 1 or 2 chapters that you feel comfortable sending if someone wants to see a little more work. Make those really polished. If they're polished and the editor likes it and they say, I really want to send this out for review, do you have more? And then they ask you to send more chapters that are not polished, that's okay. You can say, these are not finished. You can even include sort of a cover letter that says, these are not finished, this is what I plan to do with these. So that when they send the chapters to outside reviewers, the reviewers don't spend their time telling you something that you already know and you already plan to do. But the first few chapters that an editor sees, let them be very polished. And they don't have to be consecutive chapters in the book. They could just be any chapters that you think represent the scope, the depth, the originality of the work. Very often, it will be, when I see it, it will be a chapter that someone is also using as an article or as a conference paper, and then sort of repurposing it for, into an actual chapter. That's fine. Again, that's the first thing they're going to see. They're going to see the book proposal. They're going to see your writing. Number 6, you are the expert on your topic. It's up to you to point out what is original about the work. Why there is a need for it, and why you decided to write it in the first place. I can't tell you how many times I meet with academics who excitedly talk to me about their research and writing with so much enthusiasm and purpose. They tell me why they decided to work on this project, how excited they are to finish it, and I'm so excited. And then I get the book proposal, and none of that has made its way to the book proposal. None of their enthusiasm, none of their excitement, none of their sense of importance about how important this work is and how they really know that it needs to be written and it will impact its field in important ways, don't be afraid to put that in your book proposal. You should be excited about your work. Your editor should be excited about your work. So include that. I always tell people, when I was acquiring books, I used to like to know, well, how did you come to this? What brought you to this work? Those stories are usually really interesting, and they tell you a lot about the sort of context in which the book is being written, and you get a sense of the person who's writing the book, and that often translates to the kind of writer they will be when they're putting together their manuscript. So it doesn't have to be sort of, very staid prose. Show your enthusiasm, show your commitment to the work. And this is the last one in the book section. It's also very difficult. Try to complete this kind of statement. My book does for blank subject what this book did for that subject. If you can, it doesn't even have to be in the same field, but just if it's a book that people can recognize and you feel like your book is making the same kind of contribution, do that. It's really actually very effective. The next section, the next category is the process. The first point that was sent to me says, do your homework. Research the presses that you think are suitable. Know their lists both in terms of specialization and in terms of the types of books they publish. So it's not enough to know that a press publishes in Asian studies. If their Asian studies books are primarily translations used in courses, your monograph might not be right for their list. So do your homework. It's very often, talking to your colleagues, finding out what presses they've published. Those connections can also be very useful. But know who you're contacting and what they publish. And if you know some other books on their list that you think are comparable to your book in any way, it's always useful to mention that. And they will say, they don't really need to know that you know everything about their publishing, but again, it just shows that you're thinking of your book, not just like your book, but out there in the world, how your book fits in out there. Be prepared to offer names of potential reviewers if an editor decides to pursue outside reviews. This is my point, and I tell people this all the time. Many editors won't ask for that. They have a certain group of reviewers that they use all the time, but many editors will ask for that. So be prepared with a list, and even offer it before they ask. And it often happens. I know when I was acquiring books, sometimes the more sort of controversial a subject might be, the more important it is to recommend people who can fairly assess your book. And so it's good to just be armed with that, with those names. And I'd say, in my experience, about half of the editors that I've worked with my clients, actually ask for those names and use them. Ask editors about their press's review process. As I said when I opened, that process varies greatly from press to press. Some presses want exclusivity. They want to be the only press that's pursuing outside reviews. Others are fine with simultaneous submissions. Some university presses have a two-tiered approval process. They have an in-house board, and then they have an academic board. So the book has to be approved 2 times in order to get published. Some presses just have one in-house editorial committee that makes all the decisions. Ask about this. Ask about the process, because if you're clear about the process, it will make those months of waiting, and it's always months, it'll make them much less anxious, and you'll just have a sense of what's happening. In most basic terms, many of you already know this. They send you the reviews that they get. You respond to the reviews. They propose the book. Sometimes they will then, when the manuscript is finished, they send it out again for review. Sometimes they won't. It's never the same. And even within the same press, it's never the same. Because let's just say it's a book that comes in and they're trying to publish it in time for the big academic conference that's coming up, at the end of December. They might not send it out for the second review again if they read it and feel confident that you've addressed all the issues that were brought up, all the suggestions that were brought up initially. So you can ask about the process and find out exactly what it is, and that will be, then you'll also feel more comfortable to send an email to ask, when you haven't heard in 2 months, you'll feel more comfortable to say, oh, sorry, you're still waiting for the outside reviews. You should know, and that also allows you to see how responsive the editor is who is considering your work. And that's key. That's really important. You want to work with a responsive editor. I don't care what press they work for. You want them to be responsive. And here, this is the next point. This is also my point. Your editor is your lifeline throughout this process. They are the person whose job it is to get everyone else at the press excited about your book. So your editor might be acquiring 25 or 50 books a year. The people in the marketing department are marketing many more than that. And so it is your editor's job to make all those people understand your book, understand why it's important, and get them excited about marketing it and selling it. So they're your face in the press. Think about that. So if when you're meeting with them, you're not that impressed with how they're handling themselves or how they're talking about your work, know that, they are also the person who is really the one who's looking after your book through the whole process. So they'll present it at an editorial board meeting. Then when the book's about to be published, they'll present it at a sales meeting to sales reps. The editor's crucial. And so with this in mind, your relationship with your editor is key. And this relationship works best when it's a collaboration. Your editor, any editor, should be prepared to tell you why they want to publish your book and how they see it fitting into their current publishing program. If you trust your editor, the publication process will run much more smoothly. If you like your editor, it might even be rewarding. The next point, investigate possible subvention funding that might help with the cost of illustrations or permissions if those costs will be associated with your book. Try to do that in advance and let publishers know up front that you have access to that money. Because if you're proposing a book that needs to have 50 illustrations, a publisher might think it's not really feasible for them to pay for that and then price the book accordingly. So if you have access to those funds, tell them that in the book proposal even. It's good to let them know that right away. The last one in the book section, be open with your publisher about your goals for the book and what you expect. Your input on how you see your book fitting into the press's publishing program is helpful, and editors will respond to that. The last section is the market. And not surprisingly, every editor who I contacted had a lot to say about this category, the market. As an author, you must know your market. You must convince the publisher that you have written your book with a certain group of particular readers in mind. So the first point is think about your audience, know who that audience is. And most important, for academics who are used to having, captive audiences in classrooms or conference sessions, remember that the audience can choose whether or not they want to read your book. So make sure that you are thinking about that when you're writing. Make it compelling, make it exciting, make them know that they need to know this. Be realistic about the potential market for your book, especially when it comes to that elusive general reader. So I just said a little while ago, sometimes people think that makes their proposal stronger if you say there might be some crossover to general readers. There might be, but those are not the readers that university presses are trying to reach. Those are not the readers that keep them in business. So more importantly, be able to tell them, if your book is specialized, who the particular audience is that will want to read that book. Tell them very specifically how you know to reach that audience, whether it's an academic association, whether it's, a subfield in a much bigger discipline, but be realistic and be specific about who the audience is. And understand that if, the general reader, that's a very fickle audience, even for big trade publishers. Big trade publishers, they publish books. When I was in that world, I would see this happen all the time. They get excited about a book, they offer a lot of money for it, the book comes out, in a few months, not much happening, they stop, they pull out, they don't do anything else for it. Because they need books to succeed immediately in that model. University presses, it's just the opposite. They need a good, strong first year, but good university press books, what editors think of as good university press books, are books that keep building, that their audience is there year after year after year. Those are the people they need to reach, not general readers. So don't feel as though you have to. Now, if you really do have a book that in some way, well, you can say it, but don't feel like you have to say it if you don't really know that for sure. Be specific. In your book proposal, quantify the readership for your book as much as possible. When I was acquiring books, if I was able to go into my editorial committee and say, this book could be used in this class, and at this university, 160 students take that class, every semester. That mattered, those numbers. And publishers have access to, lists, marketing databases that tell them how many students are taking certain courses. But if you know specifically what those courses are, who teaches them, in what universities they're being taught, provide that information. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for that sort of specialized, sort of niche market. How do they reach these people? And that can really result in significant sales. And this is an example that I like to use. One of the first books I acquired was a U.S. women's history book called Wake Up Little Susie. It was about single pregnancy and race before Roe v. Wade. Part of the book focused on women who, at the time, in the 50s and 60s, felt that they had no choice but to give their child up for adoption. By the way, that was a dissertation. That was a book based on a dissertation. It got reviewed in the New York Times Book Review. It went on to be a very successful book, and it was a dissertation. So that's just I always like to say that because I had some questions about it when I proposed it at the meeting. So when the author did some very early bookstore talks about the book, one of the first ones, which was in Chicago, it was this huge group of people, much bigger than usually comes out in a sort of general bookstore for a reading of a scholarly book. And it turns out that these were children. These were children who were the children of the women who had given them up for adoption, and they had been given up for adoption in the 50s and 60s. And I don't know how they found out about the book, but they were there. And we quickly realized that this was sort of a readership, and it was also a pretty organized readership. They had groups, and then we started to focus on reaching that readership. And it was not only was it from a publishing perspective, not only was it gratifying because it resulted in book sales, it was incredibly gratifying for the author, who had no idea that she was going to be meeting these people, and that these people were telling these stories and connecting so much with her book. So that's just, again, about the sort of specificity. That's important to have and to know what it is. So give early thought to how you can co-promote your book with your publisher. I know you hear about this all the time, but it's really important. Do you have media contacts at your university who can help? Are you building a presence on Facebook and Twitter? Consider publishing articles related to your argument, especially with material that resonates with rather than replicates the material in your book. Op-eds especially are amazing ways to establish your name in relation to a certain topic or event. So, while you're writing, while you're researching, if something is in the news that you think is somehow related, pitch an op-ed. Publishers view op-ed, sort of you're getting your name, your byline in an op-ed, on an op-ed page, it really does help sales. And then you become sort of an expert, and then other news outlets will start to contact you. So think of that, when you're looking at the news. And it doesn't have to be the most obvious connection either, but if you can make a connection and pitch some op-eds, try that. There's nothing wrong with writing a scholarly book. Don't feel you must tell your publishers that your project will be suitable for undergraduates and general readers if you've been working on an academic project that will primarily be of interest to academics. Many of the other points touched on that as well. You, as author, are the best salesperson for your book. The editor who sent this to me said some authors hate to be self-promoters. Most every author I know does not like to self-promote. But it really is essential. And now there's really no excuse not to do it because you don't actually have to go anywhere. You don't have to meet with people in a room. You could sit at your computer. You could, sort of establish a presence, a blog, Facebook, Twitter, anything. Start establishing that presence early on. Don't start establishing it 3 months before your book is published. Start establishing it while you're still writing, while you're still researching, because that will make a difference even when you're trying to sell your book to a publisher. Build a platform. It's one of the most annoying words in publishing these days, but now everyone uses it no matter what the press. Build your platform. What's that author's platform? And really all it means is what I just said. Do you have ways that you can help sell the book? So if you have social media outlets, if you have blogs, if you even old school media contacts, before you even pitch your book, figure out what those are and present yourself and your work to as many people as possible. before the book is published. If you have written a trade or academic trade book, meaning that it is a work that has crossover appeal, you might consider hiring a freelance publicist when the book gets published. University presses have publicists. They have very good publicists, but they have one publicist for many books. Of course, the publicist at a university press is not working on every book the press publishes. The publicist will be working on the books that you see at the front of their seasonal catalogs that they put in their sort of general interest category. But they're working on several books. So if you really want to capitalize on the publicity, if you really want to get the word out there more broadly, hire a freelance publicist who can help you do that, and who will work in connection with your publisher. So they won't be replicating efforts that your publisher is already handling, but they'll be reaching new people, and they'll have new contacts. And you will be able to then pick up the phone whenever you want, and you have an idea about a place your book should be publicized, and tell that person. And you won't really be able to do that with a publicist at a press. I mean, they'll work with you, but they have a lot of other demands. So it's often not that expensive, and it can be money well spent if you really do have a book that you think can attract a wider readership. So that's all my points in all my categories. And I realize I've given you a vast amount of information in a highly condensed manner, but I really wanted to touch on what I thought of as some of the most important aspects of not only writing, but pitching and publishing academic books. There is, as you can imagine, a lot more to say about all of the points I've made, and there are many areas that I didn't even have time to touch on at all. And I knew that I might be addressing scholars in very different stages of their professional lives, so I tried to offer something for everyone. I know I'm meeting with some of you tomorrow, so I can delve more deeply into anything that you want to talk about more deeply that we talked about today. And I know we're going to have time for questions now as well. So just one final thought. It's certainly true that publishing, academic and otherwise, has changed drastically in the last 15 years, but it didn't go away. People are still publishing books, people are still reading books. And it continues to change. But the good news is that from where I sit, I think there's never been a better moment for authors to be proactive agents in the publishing process. Establishing a presence, building an audience, sharing your ideas, it's never been easier or less costly. So, don't let that pass you by. Try to do that, think about doing that. I know you're thinking about so many other things, but if you could spend a little time thinking about that, it really will serve you well, I think, throughout the process, from the book proposal until your book is published. And so it will make you, actually, a more appealing author to publishers, and it will definitely benefit your book when your book is published. The paper that Allison handed out, it's just a few resource things that you might want to read or look at. My information is on there. Feel free to contact me with any questions. And I have a Idea Architects Facebook page where I share, some publishing advice, some sort of bits and pieces that are happening with books that I've worked on, that if you like that page, you might be interested in seeing. Because what I try to do there is I try to sort of pull out examples of people who are getting recognition for their book that's not the usual kind of recognition. And it can be helpful to see that and help you to think about ways that you can do that as well.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.